Okay, so I'm going to go through the light reactions first. Let me orient you to this picture. A plant cell. And we are inside of a chloroplast. So let me go ahead and draw. This would be inside the chloroplast, right? And this is obviously way too big for a chloroplast. But inside of here, this guy right here is called a thylakoid. And it's a membrane-bound sac. And if you were to actually look at a chloroplast, there'd be bunches of them stacked on top of each other, but I've just drawn one really enlarged so you can see what's going on inside. So embedded in the membranes of the thylakoid are these photosystems. I've kind of done a cross-section of it so it looks sort of like a, like a sliced in half donut or olive. Okay, so it's a protein with a protein in the middle, and a protein with a protein in the middle, and then in between is an electron transport chain. And down here you can see ATP synthase. So these are all proteins. Over here you can see this is the cell membrane on the cell, and this is a cell wall, okay, that's made out of that cellulose. And then here I've got drawn what we call a xylem. It's just a blood vessel in a cell that carries water. And then in the cell wall there are gaps so the water can get through. They have a funny name. They're called plasmodesmata. Okay, so in here we're inside the cytoplasm, but inside of the actual chloroplast we have all these circular sacs called thylakoids. I've blown one up really big so you can see it. And right here you can see outside, this would be like the underside of the leaf. I don't know where to draw it because you can't really draw it in 3D. But this is what we call a stomata. Let me just go ahead and label that. Stomata. And that's the breathing apparatus for a plant. Allows it to breathe the air. So we've got CO2 out here that's ready to come in. And of course here's our sunshine. Okay, so in the photosystems, yes, the first one's called photosystem 2. The second one is called photosystem 1, just to make your life hard. It's just the way that they were discovered. But photosystem 2 technically happens first. So embedded in these proteins are a very special pigment that we talked about in class called chlorophyll. It's a pigment that has excitable electrons. So they're all over in here, and there's two right here in the middle reaction center. They're not special, they're just in a special location. So same thing over here. And these have excitable electrons, so that when photons come in from the sun, they start to excite these electrons and jump into outer energy shells, but none of them alone can do it to a high enough level by themselves. So what they do is they sort of combine their energy, so it's bouncing all around, and they all send it to the middle two. That's why they're special. They're in the middle. And when they get slammed with that amount of energy, electrons, which I'm going to label in red, go popping out into higher energy shells. So these are electrons. These are jazz hands electrons. And they're way out there. And then we're going to bring them down one step at a time, just like we did in our electron transport chain. So each time they jump, they're falling in energy, and they're using that energy to shuttle a proton, so it's a little positively charged proton, into the middle of the thylakoid. So we end up with a bunch of these in here as it goes down, just like in our electron transport chain. So I'm going to label this as the electron transport chain. Okay, and then again, these protons want to go out, so they'll go out through ATP synthase. It will begin to spin, and it will produce ATP through a process called photophosphorylation. Okay, so we're phosphorylating the ADP, but we're using sunlight to do it. Okay, so we've made ATP. Now let's go back to these electrons. Once they fall to this last protein, in our bodies they fall into an oxygen, but in here they just bounce back into this next photosystem, where the same process happens again. Photons come in, excite all of these chlorophylls, send their excited energy to the middle, and bounce electrons out into outer energy shells. So we now have jazz hands electrons again. Now these we're going to store, just like we stored in our body, we're going to store these in a temporary bond between NADP and H. So it's a slightly different protein, but it's very similar to ours. It just has an extra phosphate. The P does not stand for plant, but I like to think of it that way. So we've stored these temporary high energy electrons in that bond. We've made ATP. Now let's go back here to these original electrons that were in this photosystem here. Where did they come from? Because if you follow them, they've bounced down the electron transport chain, they've gone into photosystem 2, they've left, and they've been stored. So we have to replace them over here. And that's where water comes in. So let me grab our water. Our water is going to come through a plasmodesmata, and it's going to go right to here. And I'm going to draw it kind of like this. because it's got electrons in each of those bonds, right? There's 2 electrons in each of these. So 2 of those electrons are going to go out here and replace this, and these H's can then become H pluses, these protons. The oxygen, though, is now negatively charged, so it shares with another oxygen and becomes O2. Okay? It's not negatively charged, it's just missing 2 electrons. And so it shares with an O2, and that O2 can be breathed out. We'll just bring it all the way around, breathed out the stomata into the air. Thank you, plants. Okay, so that's where the oxygen comes from, and that's where the water goes. So these are the light reactions. So in the light reactions, we've produced ATP and high-energy electrons, which are 2 components of what we need to build a sugar. So I'm going to go to a next slide and show you what happens with those to build a sugar. Okay, so we're still inside the chloroplast. I've just shrunk things down a little bit. We still have our stomata over here where the CO2 can come in, and we have the sun shining. These are the thylakoids where all of that stuff happened, and if you remember, in the thylakoids, we have produced ATP, and we've produced these high-energy electrons that are currently being stored on an NADPH. Okay, so now it's time to make a sugar, and that happens in a cycle called the Calvin cycle. And in this case, it's going to take in CO2 because that's the last component that we need in order to build a sugar. It's going to take in ATP, and it's going to take in high-energy electrons, and it's going to produce a 3-carbon sugar, very much like a 3-carbon sugar that gets produced, pyruvate, from glycolysis. And then we can take those 2 3-carbon sugars outside of the chloroplast and create glucose, which is a 6-carbon sugar, which they'll then store. Okay, so this is called our dark reactions because it doesn't require light. Now there's one really important enzyme I want to point out to you. It's called Rubisco. It's probably the most important enzyme on Earth because it's the enzyme that's able to pull CO2 out of the air and create organic compounds. It's the whole reason we're here and alive. And we'll talk more about it in class.